Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at resource allocation and how resources are allocated in the Australian economy. And we look in Chapter 2 a little bit more about relative prices and how that impacts resource allocation, but just gives you a bit of a general understanding of how resources are allocated in the Australian economy. So resource allocation is all about making decisions about how our scarce land, labour and capital inputs are to be used in production. Okay, what types of goods and services are we going to produce? So it includes things like, should the government allocate their resources and money to education and health, or roads, or defence? Should individuals use their labour resources to become teachers, miners and chefs? So we're looking at the government, how they use their resources, how individuals use their resources. Do businesses use their capital resources to manufacture big cars, small cars, hybrid cars? How do we make these decisions? And the aim of resource allocation, like we talked about in the first video, is to maximise our total living standards today and into the future. Now, here's a question that people struggle with that I just thought I'd go through with you. Explain what is meant by the following statement. Economics is about how our resources are allocated among competing uses. How do we answer a question like that? Well, here's how you go about it. All of the nation's resources, land, labour, capital and entrepreneurship, can be used in a variety of competing pursuits. So all of these resources have a very varied amount of uses. They can be used for many different things, such as land that can be used for farming, manufacturing, mining or housing. However, all resources are finite and therefore scarce, when compared to the demands placed on them. This means that every economy needs to make decisions or choices about how its relatively scarce resources will be used in the production of goods and services, or how they will be used among competing uses. So in a question like this, you need to be able to define what resources are, explain the fact that they are scarce or that they are finite, and therefore we need to make choices about which areas we're going to shift our resource into. You also want to explain what it means by competing uses. So a good example to use would be water. Water can be used for showering, for drinking, in agriculture, in big business, but it is still a scarce resource and we need to make choices about how it's going to be used. And therefore some uses may be sacrificed. So for example, unless you have a tank, you can't water your car, because that's one of the competing uses for that product. All economies have to answer three basic questions: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. They are the three questions that any economy needs to decide how they're going to go about their production. And how does Australia answer these questions? With the aim of trying to boost our living standards. Well, the first one is what and how much to produce. So what type and what quantities of each particular good or service are we going to produce with our limited resources? Where are we going to put our resources to maximise society's best interests? Are we going to make chocolate bars? Are we going to make cars? Are we going to mine for minerals? How are we going to allocate our resources? And in Australia, we generally answer this question based on the market or the price mechanism, or consumer sovereignty. This is a critical term you need to understand. Consumer sovereignty, but the government has some influence in where we allocate our resources. So consumer sovereignty is this idea that consumers are king. Consumers decide where producers will place their resources. Why do consumers decide? Well, because producers act in their own self-interest. Producers are not going to produce what consumers don't want. Why? Because they won't make any profits. If people aren't going to buy their product, logically producers aren't going to produce. So consumer sovereignty is the idea that producers will produce what consumers want, because that's where they're going to get the higher relative prices, because there's going to be the higher demand. And this acts as an incentive for producers to shift their resources to the production of these goods and services, because that's where they're going to get the highest profits. So consumer sovereignty, consumer is king. Producers produce what consumers want most of the time, because that's where they're going to generate the highest profit. Can you quickly tell me, when would consumer sovereignty not exist in a market? And along with this idea of consumer sovereignty, you'll hear the term the invisible hand. This is a term devised by Adam Smith, and basically what that means is that when people can choose freely what to produce and what to buy, the invisible hand of competition guides producers to produce what consumers demand. Why? Because that's where they're going to get the highest profit. So the invisible hand is producers will produce what consumers want, that the free market works. The free market is the best way to allocate resources, because automatically producers will produce what consumers want, because that's where they're going to generate the highest profit. Acting in their own self-interest, they only care about their own profits, their own profit motive. They are going to generate what society wants, because that's where it's going to generate the highest profit. Now, there are flaws in this system, but that's what the invisible hand means. Second thing is how to produce, and that's basically what method of production are we going to use. Are we going to be labour intensive, where we use a lot of labour in production, or are we going to be capital intensive, where we use a lot of technology and machinery in production? The two, labour and capital, can often be described as interchangeable, so they can be used to perform similar tasks. Because Australia has a capitalist system where we have private ownership of resources, the aim is to maximise profits and use the lowest cost and most efficient production methods possible. So in simple terms, businesses are going to use whatever combination of labour and capital that generates the highest amount of profit. So if it's more efficient for them to use capital, they will use capital instead of labour. If it's more efficient for them to use labour, they will use labour instead of capital. It's as simple as that. And that's why we'll see more self-checkouts at supermarkets. We've developed the technology, businesses see that it's more profitable, and therefore they will use self-checkouts. If it wasn't more profitable, if they were losing money, if people were stealing too many goods and services, they would go back to the old system. They're going to do whatever is most profitable. And the last one is for whom to produce. How will the income created from the production of goods and services be shared among society? Okay, and in Australia, that's largely determined based on who has the resources, who has the land, labour and capital resources. So if we own a lot of land, we will generate a lot of rent. If we have productive labour resources, if we are skilled, if we have skills that are in high demand, we will generate a high level of income. So for whom to produce is all based on the quality and quantity of people's access to resources. Okay, so people with better labour resources, cleverer people, people that have skills that are in demand will generate a higher slice of the pie. But then the government steps in and redistributes income. So in Australia, this is reliant on the market system and our capitalist system of ownership. Okay, whoever owns the factors of production will generate higher income. That means that the distribution of income is quite unequal, and wealth received by individuals before the government intervenes is very unequal, and therefore the government has to intervene to make it more equitable. Alright, last part, how do we allocate resources in Australia? Okay, so how do we decide how, for whom and what to produce? Sorry, what to produce, how to produce and for whom to produce. Well, Australia has Australia has a mixed economy. Okay, it's a mix between market capitalism and planned socialism. And what I mean by that is that buyers and sellers interact to determine prices and determine 80% of what is produced in Australia. So where is the highest profit, we will shift resources because that will get us the higher relative profits and we can make more money. However, the government will intervene in the market to distribute income. So 20% of our economy is based on government intervention. So the government will intervene not only to redistribute income, it will provide essential goods and services. So it will provide public housing for those that can't afford it. It will provide parks and recreation and public goods, and will also limit the production of certain goods and services. So it will even though consumer sovereignty might dictate, that producers produce illicit drugs or produce heroin, the government's going to step in and stop production of goods that are socially undesirable. So we're not a completely capitalist society. If that was the case, then anything could be produced that was in high demand. That is not the case in Australia. We're going to look at this slide a little bit more in class, looking at some of the other influences on resource allocation.